He was just the electrician. Worn boots, calloused hands, a toolbox that had seen better decades. Nobody looked twice at Caleb Ryland when he walked into that cafe. And that was exactly how he wanted it. But the moment a man in a $1,000 suit grabbed him by the collar and shoved him in front of a room full of strangers, something shifted in the air. Not in Caleb. In everyone watching him not react. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in a room isn't the loudest voice. Sometimes it's the man who goes completely, terrifyingly still. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Let's get into it. The call came in on a Tuesday, which was fine. Tuesdays were good days for Caleb Ryland. His daughter had art class on Tuesdays. He dropped Maisie off at Roosevelt Elementary at 7:52, same as always, and she ran toward the front doors without looking back, her backpack bouncing between her shoulder blades, her sneakers, the ones with the small constellation of dried paint on the left toe from last month's project, slapping the wet pavement. She hadn't said goodbye. She rarely did anymore. She was 7, and 7-year-olds apparently had more important things to think about than their fathers. He stood at the curb and watched until the doors swung shut behind her, and then he sat in the truck for another 30 seconds doing nothing at all. It was a thing he did. Nobody knew about it. He didn't fully understand it himself. He drove to the job. The cafe was on Wabash, tucked between a Thai place that had been there since the 90s and a dry cleaner with a handwritten sign in the window advertising alterations. The cafe itself was called Elan, French word, though nothing else about the place was particularly French. It was the kind of spot that charged $18 for an avocado toast and called it artisanal. Caleb had been inside once before, 2 years ago, to look at the lighting over the bar. He hadn't gone back. Too quiet in the way that expensive places are quiet, where the silence itself costs something. He parked in the loading zone and pulled out his phone to review the service order. Electrical panel in the basement utility room. The cafe's owner, a tired-looking man named Dennis Park, had called Ryland Electric, which was just Caleb and a part-time assistant named Roy, who was currently dealing with a pulled muscle from a kayaking incident, because the panel had been throwing breaker trips all week, and the last electrician Dennis hired had told him it was fine and charged him $400 to say so. It was not fine. Caleb could tell from the service notes alone. There was a wiring issue in the original 1940s infrastructure that the renovations in 2019 had never properly addressed. He'd seen it before in these old Wabash buildings. The bones were stubborn. He grabbed his toolbox, locked the truck, and went inside. So the cafe was doing a moderate Tuesday morning business. Maybe 30 people, give or take, spread across tables made of reclaimed wood that had been sanded to an artificial smoothness. The music was low, some kind of acoustic folk that Caleb couldn't name. Baristas moved behind the counter with the focused, slightly theatrical efficiency of people who took their craft seriously. He found Dennis near the hostess stand, a man in his mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the look of someone who hadn't slept quite right in several days. "Mr. Ryland," Dennis extended a hand and shook it firmly. "Thank you for coming so quickly. The main panel's been... We had another trip this morning, right in the middle of the breakfast rush." "I'll take a look," Caleb said. "Basement's through the kitchen. I'll show you." "I can find it." Dennis hesitated, then nodded. He'd learned, in the brief phone call they'd had the day before, that Caleb Ryland wasn't a man who needed a lot of hand-holding. Caleb crossed the cafe floor, toolbox at his side, and didn't look at anyone. That was second nature, moving through a room without drawing attention, cataloging exits and sightlines and the positions of people out of pure habit without actually thinking about it. Old training, useless now. He moved through the kitchen, past a line cook who barely glanced up, and found the basement stairs without asking. He worked for an hour and 40 minutes without interruption. The panel was worse than the service notes had suggested, which was more or less what he'd expected. The previous electrician had done a band-aid job on 3 circuits while completely missing the root issue, a degraded neutral connection that had been creating voltage fluctuations across the entire board. Caleb pulled the panel cover, traced the problem methodically, and fixed it the right way, not the fast way. He replaced the damaged wiring, checked every breaker, tested the load balance, and made a note in his job log about 2 additional items Dennis would need to address within the year if he wanted to avoid a more expensive problem. He came back upstairs just after 9:30, toolbox in hand, and went to the counter to ask for Dennis. The barista, a young woman with an undercut and a small tattoo of a moth on her wrist, said Dennis had stepped out but would be back in 20 minutes. Did he want to wait? Caleb looked around the cafe. There was a stool at the end of the counter near the window. "Can I get a coffee?" he said. "Of course. What are you having?" "Whatever's already made." She smiled at that, a quick, unguarded smile, and poured him a drip coffee in a ceramic mug. He paid for it in cash, sat down on the stool, and looked out the window at Wabash, at the L tracks overhead, casting their grid-patterned shadows on the street below, at the ordinary movement of a Tuesday morning in Chicago. He thought about Maisie's art project. She'd mentioned something about printmaking. He wasn't sure he knew what printmaking was exactly, but she'd been excited about it in the specific, contained way she got excited about things. Not loud, not dramatic, just this subtle brightness that settled into her eyes. She had her mother's eyes. He drank his coffee. He noticed the group at the large corner table the way he noticed most things, peripherally, without meaning to. 6 people. Business casual to full business formal. Laptops and folders and the remnants of a working breakfast. The energy of the group was tense in that particular corporate way, where everyone is performing competence for the benefit of one specific person. That person, Caleb could tell without trying, was the woman at the head of the table. She was 30, maybe 31, dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested she'd done it herself, fast, in a car or an elevator, and didn't care if it wasn't perfect. She was leaning forward over a spreadsheet, making a point with a pen she kept clicking, not nervously, but rhythmically, like a metronome. The people around her were paying attention in the way people pay attention when they're a little afraid of falling behind. Caleb looked away. Not his business. He was watching a pigeon navigate the L tracks when the voice came. "Hey. Hey, guy." He didn't respond immediately, because in his experience, a man who says, "Hey, guy," to a stranger isn't looking for anything good. "Electrician, with the box." He turned then, slowly. The man was standing 6 feet away, arms crossed, in the kind of suit that was designed to tell you exactly how much it cost, without the wearer having to say a word. He was mid-40s, tall, with the particular posture of a man who had never once in his adult life been told no by someone he considered beneath him. His face had a ruddy quality, a certain flush in the cheeks that either came from drinking or from the perpetual low-grade anger of someone who felt chronically underappreciated. "Can I help you?" Caleb said. "You're in our space." The man gestured broadly at the counter, at Caleb's stool, at approximately the entire section of the cafe between where they were standing and the front door. "We have a reservation." Caleb looked around. The cafe didn't have reservations. It had tables, and the man's group was at a table across the room. "I'm at the counter," Caleb said, "and the counter is in our space." "I don't think that's how it works." The man's nostrils did something unpleasant. He looked Caleb up and down. Work boots, canvas pants with a streak of dust from the basement crawl space, a gray thermal with a small tear at the left cuff. And his expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a sneer, but was trying to be. "You finished with your little repair job?" he said. "Because service workers generally don't linger." Caleb said nothing. "Is that a policy they didn't explain to you? When you're done with the job, you leave. You don't sit at the counter drinking coffee and taking up space that paying customers need." "I am a paying customer," Caleb said. His voice was even. Not aggressive, not defensive, just a statement of fact. The man laughed, a short, contemptuous sound that he made sure was audible to the nearby tables. "Paying customer, right. What'd you have, a $3 drip? You carry that toolbox everywhere so people know you're the kind of man who does manual labor?" He said manual labor the way some people say a disease name. "Look at you. I'm surprised they let you in here wearing that." At the corner table, a couple of the executives had looked up. The woman with the pen had not. She was still reading the spreadsheet. Caleb picked up his coffee mug and took a slow sip. "I'm talking to you," the man said. "I know," Caleb said. "I'm choosing not to engage." Something shifted in the man's face. A vein at his temple did something. He was not accustomed to being dismissed. Not gently, not quietly, not in any way. He stepped closer. "You got a kid, buddy?" he said, his voice dropping into something that was designed to be nastier at lower volume. "I saw you on the phone earlier, talking about your daughter." He said the word in a mock-tender way that made a woman at a nearby two-top flinch. What's she going to think when she grows up and realizes her dad spends his life crawling around in basements fixing other people's problems? That she's got some blue-collar loser for a father who can't even afford to get his boots resoled? The cafe went a degree quieter. Caleb set the mug down on the counter. He looked at the man, really looked at him, the way he didn't usually let himself look at people, which was directly, without anything softening it. And the man, to his credit, held the gaze for a full 3 seconds before something in his eyes flickered. "I'm going to ask you to walk away," Caleb said. "You're going to ask me?" "I'm asking once." The man laughed again, but it was thinner this time. He turned to glance back at his table, a checking motion, making sure his audience was watching. And then he turned back and shoved Caleb, both hands flat against his chest, hard. The stool scraped back. The coffee mug tilted and didn't fall only because Caleb's right hand caught the edge of the counter. The cafe went completely silent. Not the polite ambient quiet of before. Something different. The kind of silence that descends when a room collectively holds its breath. Caleb stood up. He straightened. He adjusted the cuff of his thermal where it had ridden up, and then he picked up the coffee mug, set it back upright on the counter, and looked at the man. "Don't touch me again," he said. 3 words. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lower it. He said it the way you'd tell someone the temperature outside, as a simple, unambiguous piece of information. But the room didn't relax. It stayed suspended because something in those 3 words, or in the quality of silence that followed them, told every person within earshot the same thing simultaneously. This man, this worn boots, canvas pants, basement-crawling, coffee-drinking man, was not afraid. He was not embarrassed. He was not calculating how to get away from a confrontation. He was, if anything, utterly and completely calm in a way that was more unsettling than any show of anger could have been. The man in the expensive suit stared at him. His jaw was tight. His face had gone from red to a kind of mottled pale. "You got something to say to me?" the man said, but the volume had changed. The performance had cracked somewhere behind his eyes. "No," Caleb said. "I said what I needed to say." He sat back down on the stool and looked out the window. It was in that moment, for the first time, that Olivia Sterling looked up from her spreadsheet. She had heard the exchange, most of it, at least the parts that had been loud enough to cut through her concentration. She'd assumed it was Victor, because it was almost always Victor, and she'd made the internal calculation she made approximately 3 times a week, which was whether to intervene now or let it resolve itself and deal with the fallout afterward. She'd been about to intervene when the shove happened. She watched the man at the counter, the electrician, the one with the toolbox, absorb it. Not absorb it the way a person absorbs a blow they couldn't avoid. Absorb it the way someone absorbs information they expected. And then she watched him set down the mug, straighten his cuff, and speak. 3 words. She couldn't fully hear them from where she was sitting, but she read them on his lips well enough. "Don't touch me again." She watched Victor's face in the aftermath. She had known Victor Haynes for 4 years, had promoted him twice, had defended him to 3 separate board members who'd had complaints about his conduct. She knew his face very well. And right now his face was doing something she'd never seen it do before. It was calculating, not whether to push back, whether it was safe to. Olivia set down her pen. Around the cafe, people had begun to breathe again, cautiously, like the air might shift back at any moment. A barista had appeared at the end of the counter, uncertain. 2 tables away, a man had his phone up. Not obviously, but it was up. Victor made a noise that was supposed to sound dismissive and walked back toward the corner table, straightening his jacket. "Victor," Olivia said quietly when he sat down. "The guy's got no business sitting there." "We'll talk about it later," she said. Her eyes went back to the counter. The electrician had his coffee mug in his hand again and was looking out the window. He didn't look shaken. He didn't look triumphant. He looked the same way he'd looked when she first noticed him, before any of this. Like a man with somewhere else to be, giving himself a few minutes of stillness before he got there. She found herself wondering who he was. She found herself wondering what he'd actually done exactly that had made a room full of strangers go that quiet. Not because of the words, but because of what the words sat on top of, like text on a page that meant something different depending on what you knew about the person who'd written it. She clicked her pen once and looked back at the spreadsheet, but she didn't see the numbers for a while. Dennis came back at 9:53, moving quickly, apologizing before he'd fully cleared the door. Caleb stood up, settled the job details in less than 4 minutes, gave Dennis a printed invoice and a typed list of the secondary items he'd flagged, declined the offer of a second coffee, and picked up his toolbox. He walked to the door. He did not look at the corner table. He did not look for the man in the expensive suit. He moved through the room the same way he'd moved into it, without friction, without announcement. Outside, the L train passed overhead, and the shadow swept the street below like something being erased. Caleb unlocked the truck, loaded the toolbox into the back, and stood for a moment with his hand on the tailgate. Maisie got out of school at 3:15. He had a service call in Pilsen at 11, a panel inspection in Bridgeport at 1:30, and if those both went clean, he'd have enough time to stop at the grocery store before pickup. She'd been asking for those fruit pouches she liked, the mango ones, and he kept forgetting. He got in the truck and pulled out his phone and added mango pouches to the Notes app, where it joined a list that currently included permission slip, Science Museum, call dentist, her, check if Blue Jacket needs dry cleaning, and birthday. Ask about party versus just us. He put the truck in drive. Tuesday was a good day. He was 3 blocks away when his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. This is Olivia Sterling. I'm the CEO of the company whose team was at Elan this morning. I want to apologize for what happened with my director of operations. That was unacceptable. If you'd be willing to speak with me, I'd appreciate the opportunity. Caleb read it at a red light. He put the phone face down on the passenger seat and kept driving. He had a job in Pilsen. He didn't answer the text. He thought about it once, briefly, somewhere between the Pilsen job and the Bridgeport inspection, while he was eating a gas station sandwich in his truck with the windows cracked because the afternoon had turned unexpectedly warm for October. The sandwich was bad, processed turkey on bread that had given up, and the text sat on his phone screen like something he was supposed to deal with but kept choosing not to. He read it one more time, then locked the phone and finished the sandwich and drove to Bridgeport. The inspection went clean. He wrote up the report in the truck, emailed it to the property manager, and made it to the Jewel Osco on Ashland with 40 minutes to spare before school pickup. He bought the mango pouches. He bought milk, eggs, a bag of those small tangerines Maisie liked to peel herself, and a rotisserie chicken that was probably 4 hours old but would do fine for dinner if he pulled the meat off and mixed it into pasta. He stood in the checkout line behind a woman buying a birthday cake and 3 bags of ice and thought, for no particular reason, about the way the cafe had gone quiet. Not the confrontation itself. The silence after. He'd felt it before. That specific quality of a room recalibrating around him. People sensing something they couldn't name. It used to happen more often, back when he carried the training closer to the surface, when it lived in his posture and his eyes and the way he entered a room. He'd spent 3 years deliberately unlearning it, softening the edges, teaching himself to take up less space. Not because he was ashamed, because that version of himself belonged to a life he'd left, and the man Maisie needed didn't walk into rooms making people nervous. But today it had surfaced, just for a second, just long enough for everyone to notice. He paid for the groceries and drove to Roosevelt Elementary. Maisie came out at 3:17, 2 minutes late, with a piece of green construction paper in her hand and her jacket tied around her waist instead of on her body. She climbed into the truck and buckled her seatbelt without being reminded, which was new. How was art? He said. We did printmaking. Yeah? What did you print? She held up the construction paper. On it, in slightly smudged ink, was a tree. Not a good tree, objectively. The trunk was too thick and the branches looked like they were reaching in different directions out of confusion rather than toward the light. But it was unmistakably a tree. And she'd made it. And Caleb felt the thing he always felt when she showed him something she'd created, which was a tightness in his throat that he'd learned to swallow before she noticed. That's great, Mize. The ink got on my hands. She held them up. Her fingers were stained blue-black. Mrs. Chen said it'll come off with soap, but it didn't come off with soap. We'll try dish soap at home. Is dish soap different? It's more aggressive. She considered this. Aggressive how? He glanced at her, 7 years old and already demanding specificity. She had that from him, or maybe from her mother, who had been the same way, precise about language even when it didn't matter, especially when it didn't matter. It cuts through grease better, he said. The ink has an oil base. Regular soap doesn't break down oil the way dish soap does. Oh. She looked at her hands again, rotating them in the afternoon light coming through the window. I kind of like them like this. It looks like I did something important. He smiled at that. He couldn't help it. They went home. Home was a 2-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a 3-flat in Avondale, on a street with old trees and cracked sidewalks, and the kind of neighbors who waved but didn't linger. The apartment was small enough that Caleb could hear Maisie's alarm clock from his bedroom, and large enough that she had her own space, her own door to close, her own walls covered in a gradually expanding gallery of art projects and printed out photographs of animals she intended to someday meet. There was a stuffed penguin on her bed named Gerald, who she'd had since she was 2 and who was missing one eye and most of his structural integrity. She treated Gerald with the tender, slightly bossy affection of a mother whose child was chronically ill. Caleb made dinner. Pasta with the rotisserie chicken and a jar of marinara he doctored with garlic and a little bit of red pepper flake, while Maisie sat at the kitchen table doing her reading worksheet and narrating her complaints about it. This word doesn't make sense. Which word? Enormous. Why isn't it just big? Because enormous is bigger than big. Then why not just say really big? Because English has too many words, and we have to use all of them or they get lonely. She gave him a look. The look she'd been perfecting since she turned 6, the one that said she knew he was joking but hadn't decided whether to reward it with a laugh. She went back to the worksheet. He drained the pasta and mixed everything together and put 2 plates on the table. They ate. After dinner, after the dishes, after the ink removal attempt with dish soap that was only partially successful, after the reading worksheet was finished and checked, and the backpack was repacked and the teeth were brushed, and Gerald was positioned on the pillow at the correct angle, Caleb sat on the edge of her bed and Maisie said, "Dad?" "Yeah." "Did you have a good day?" It was a thing she'd started doing recently, asking about his day the way he asked about hers. He didn't know where she'd picked it up. Maybe from a teacher, maybe from a show. It caught him off guard every time. "I had a good day," he said. "What did you do?" "Fixed some wiring, drove around, bought you mango pouches." Her eyes lit up. "The good ones?" "The good ones." She pulled the blanket up to her chin and looked at him with an expression that was so much like her mother's. That particular blend of warmth and scrutiny, like she was checking to make sure you meant what you said, that for a moment he couldn't breathe. "Good night, Mais." "Night, Dad." He turned off the light and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the sound of her settling in, the small adjustments of a 7-year-old body finding its exact right position, the soft declaration of "Good night, Gerald," that she didn't know he could hear. He went to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water and stood at the counter and looked at his phone. The text from Olivia Sterling was still there. He deleted it. The next morning, the phone rang at 7:14 while he was packing Maisie's lunch. The number was different, a landline, a business prefix. He let it ring. It went to voicemail. He listened to it while Maisie was putting on her shoes. "Mr. Ryland, this is Lauren Whitmore, General Counsel for Sterling Dynamics. I'm calling on behalf of Olivia Sterling regarding an incident involving one of our executives at Elan Café yesterday morning. We'd like to discuss the matter with you at your convenience. Please call me back at..." He deleted the voicemail too. But the calls kept coming. 2 more that day, one from the same landline and one from a mobile number he didn't recognize. He didn't answer either. He had a full day. A rewire in Logan Square, a service call in Humboldt Park, and an estimate for a restaurant build-out in Wicker Park that turned out to be more complicated than the owner had described on the phone, which was almost always the case. He worked. He picked up Maisie. He made dinner. He didn't think about the cafe or the man in the expensive suit or the woman at the head of the table. Or he tried not to. The thing about not thinking about something was that the effort of not thinking about it was itself a form of thinking about it, a low-grade awareness humming underneath everything else like a frequency just below hearing. On Thursday, she found him. He was on a ladder outside a residential 3-flat in Bucktown, replacing an exterior junction box, when a silver sedan pulled up to the curb and a woman got out of the passenger side with a briefcase and an expression that suggested she'd been looking for him for 2 days and was very tired of it. She was mid-40s, sharp-featured, with the kind of professional composure that comes from years of saying precise things in rooms full of people who didn't want to hear them. Her suit was dark blue, and her shoes were the kind of flats that cost real money, but didn't advertise it. "Caleb Ryland," she said, standing on the sidewalk and looking up at him on the ladder. "Depends on who's asking." "Lauren Whitmore, General Counsel, Sterling Dynamics. I left you 2 voicemails." "I know." "You didn't call back." "I know that too." She paused, recalibrating. He could see her doing it, adjusting whatever script she'd prepared based on the reality of the man in front of her, who was standing on a ladder with wire strippers in his hand and no apparent interest in having a conversation. "Could you come down?" she said. "I have something important to discuss with you." "I'm in the middle of a job." "Mr. Ryland, I've been trying to reach you for 48 hours. The CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company is personally requesting a meeting with you. Most people would at least return the call." He looked down at her. "I'm not most people." "I'm beginning to understand that." He finished stripping the wire he was working on, capped it, and climbed down the ladder. He set the strippers on the top step and wiped his hands on his pants and looked at Lauren Whitmore the way he looked at most things, steadily, without agenda. "5 minutes," he said. She nodded. "Victor Haynes, the man who confronted you at Elan, has been placed on administrative review. Ms. Sterling is taking the incident seriously. She'd like to apologize in person and discuss next steps." "There are no next steps. A guy shoved me in a coffee shop. It's not a legal matter." "It could be. What he did constitutes assault. You'd have grounds to file charges, and the company could face liability for—" "I'm not filing anything." Lauren studied him. He could tell she was good at her job because she didn't push. She stood there and let the silence do the work, which was a technique he recognized because he used it himself. On the rare occasions when it was used on him, he found it mildly amusing. "All right," she said. "But there's something else. Something unrelated to the cafe incident, or possibly very related, depending on how you look at it. I have to finish this junction box." 3 years ago, Sterling Dynamics was on the verge of losing a $900 million defense contract. A cyber attack nearly compromised our entire secure communications infrastructure. We were 48 hours from catastrophic data exposure when an outside specialist, hired through a chain of intermediaries so layered that our own IT department didn't know who he was, identified the breach point, neutralized the threat, and disappeared. No follow-up, no invoice beyond what had already been arranged, no name. Caleb's hands were still. "It took me 18 months and significant resources to trace the chain back to its origin," Lauren said. "The specialist was operating under a contractor alias routed through 2 private security firms. But the work itself left a signature. Not a digital one, a methodological one. The way the breach was handled, the sequencing, the counter-intrusion architecture, the specific protocols used, was consistent with NSA-level cybersecurity training adapted for field application. Which is not something you learn at a coding boot camp." She paused. "The specialist was you, Mr. Ryland." He said nothing for a long time. A car passed on the street behind them. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something only it could see. "I was hired to solve a problem," he said finally. "I solved it." "You saved a company you had no connection to from losing nearly $1 billion. I was paid for the work." "You were paid $40,000 for what was conservatively a multi-million-dollar intervention." $40,000 was the contract. I don't renegotiate after the fact." Lauren looked at him, really looked at him. The kind of sustained evaluative gaze that attorneys use when they're trying to determine whether someone is lying or telling the truth, or, in rarer cases, operating from a moral framework so foreign to the legal profession that it requires a complete recalibration of assumptions. Miss Sterling would like to thank you, she said. Personally. She doesn't need to. She wants to. Tell her I appreciate the thought. I have a junction box to finish and a daughter to pick up at 3:15. Those are the two things on my list today. He turned and went back to the ladder. Lauren stood on the sidewalk for another 10 seconds, briefcase at her side, and then she said, "Your daughter, Maisie, right?" He stopped. His hand was on the ladder rung. He didn't turn around, but the quality of his stillness changed. "That's not information you should have," he said. "It's public record. School enrollment, address." "Don't say her name again." It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. But it carried the same weight as the three words in the café, and Lauren Whitmore, who had spent 20 years in corporate law and had faced down hostile depositions and boardroom confrontations, and once, memorably, a man who threw a chair during a merger negotiation, took a half step back without meaning to. "I apologize," she said. That was overstepping. Caleb climbed the ladder. He didn't look back. Lauren got in the sedan. The car pulled away from the curb. He watched it go in his peripheral vision, and then he picked up the wire strippers and went back to work. And his hands were steady, and his breathing was even, and nobody watching him would have known that his heart was hammering against his ribs like something trying to get out. He finished the junction box. He drove to his next job. He picked up Maisie at 3:15. That night, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and ran the searches he hadn't run in 3 years. Sterling Dynamics, Olivia Sterling, Victor Haynes, Lauren Whitmore. He read through earnings reports and press coverage and LinkedIn profiles and board minutes that were public record, and he cross-referenced them against the things he already knew, the things he'd learned during the 48 hours he'd spent inside the company's systems 3 years ago, dismantling an attack that had been more sophisticated than anyone at Sterling Dynamics had realized. He closed the laptop at 11:40 and sat in the dark kitchen and listened to the radiator clicking. The thing about leaving a life behind was that it didn't leave you behind. Not really. You could move to a different city and take a different name. Not literally, but functionally, becoming a person so far removed from the one you'd been that nobody looking at both versions would connect them. You could learn a trade and build a business and raise a daughter and pay your bills on time and show up at school events and drive a truck that needed new brake pads and eat gas station sandwiches in parking lots. You could do all of that, and the life you left would still be there, underneath, like old wiring behind new drywall. Invisible, but live, carrying current whether you wanted it to or not. He went to bed. On Friday morning, Olivia Sterling was standing next to his truck when he came out of Roosevelt Elementary after dropping off Maisie. She was alone. No sedan, no attorney, no entourage. She was wearing a dark coat over a gray sweater, and her hair was down, and she was holding 2 cups of coffee from the place across the street that wasn't Elan. He stopped walking about 10 feet away. "Before you say anything," she said, "I know this is unusual, and I know you've been avoiding me, which is your right. But I'm here because I owe you something, and I don't like owing people." "You don't owe me anything. I owe you an apology. A real one. Not through a text or a voicemail or my attorney. Your attorney already apologized. Lauren apologized for the company. I'm apologizing for myself." She held out one of the coffee cups. "Can I have 5 minutes? I'll say what I came to say, and then I'll leave, and you'll never hear from me again." He looked at her. She was not performing. He'd spent enough years reading people, in briefing rooms, in hostile environments, across tables where the wrong read meant someone didn't come home, to know when someone was putting on a show. Olivia Sterling was not putting on a show. She was standing on a sidewalk in Avondale at 8 in the morning, holding coffee she'd bought for a stranger, and she was nervous. He took the cup. 5 minutes, he said. They walked. Not far, just down the block, past the playground where Maisie sometimes played after school, past the small garden plot that the building next door maintained with varying degrees of commitment. It was cold. Their breath made small clouds that dissipated before they had a chance to become anything. "What Victor did was inexcusable," Olivia said. "I was sitting 12 feet away, and I let it happen. I heard the way he talked to you, and I didn't intervene immediately. I should have. That's on me. He's not your responsibility. He's my employee. He was representing my company. That makes him my responsibility. Then fire him. She glanced at him, surprised by the directness. It's being handled. There's a process. There's always a process. You don't think much of corporate procedure. I think procedure is what people hide behind when they don't want to make hard decisions. She was quiet for a moment. He could tell the observation had landed somewhere uncomfortable, which hadn't been his intention, but which he wasn't going to apologize for either. Lauren told me about the cybersecurity work, Olivia said. 3 years ago, the Meridian breach. She told me she told you. Why didn't you ever come forward? You saved the company from losing nearly $1 billion contract. You could have leveraged that into anything, a permanent position, a consulting deal, public recognition. I was hired to do a job. I did it. The contract specified anonymity. I honored the terms. The terms were designed to protect the intermediaries, not to erase you. I didn't feel erased. She stopped walking and turned to face him. They were standing near a chain-link fence that bordered the playground. Through it, he could see the swing set, the wood chips scattered in that pattern that only made sense if you understood how 7-year-olds used a playground, running in chaotic spirals that somehow always ended at the same 3 spots. Who are you? Olivia said. I'm an electrician. That's what you do. I asked who you are. He looked at her. The coffee was warm in his hand. The morning was gray, the kind of gray that Chicago specializes in during October. Not dramatic, not stormy, just a low, flat ceiling of cloud that makes everything underneath it feel compressed and temporary. I'm a single father, he said. I have a daughter who goes to that school. I fix wiring for a living. I drive a truck that needs brake pads. I make pretty decent pasta. He paused. That's who I am. And before that? Before that was before. She studied him. He could see her mind working, not in the frantic, grasping way that Victor's had worked in the café, calculating angles and advantages, but methodically, the way an engineer studies a problem, looking for the point where the visible structure connects to something deeper. All right, she said, I won't push, but I want you to know what you did in the café. Not just the way you handled Victor, the way you handled yourself. I run a company with 4,000 employees, and I've never seen anyone do what you did. You had every right to hit him. Most people would have. You chose not to. Hitting him wasn't going to solve anything. No, but it would have felt good. He almost smiled. It would have felt good for about 3 seconds. Then there would have been police and paperwork, and my daughter asking me why I hit someone. Olivia looked down at her coffee. Lauren's right about you. You're not what you seem. I'm exactly what I seem. People just don't like what they're seeing. She met his eyes again. There was something in her expression that he couldn't quite categorize. Not pity, not admiration, not the performative gratitude of a CEO making a public relations gesture. Something quieter than all of those things. Something that looked, if he was being honest, like recognition. Thank you, she said, for the Meridian breach, for not pressing charges against Victor, for the 5 minutes. She held out her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm, direct, the handshake of a person who'd learned early that anything less would be used against her. If you ever need anything, she started. I won't, he said. She nodded. She didn't look offended. She looked like she'd expected exactly that answer. She walked back toward the street, and he watched her go. Not because he wanted to, but because old habits are old habits, and you always watch the person leave. You watch until they're gone, and then you check the space they left behind. He finished his coffee standing by the playground fence. Then he drove to work. The Pilsen job that day was a mess. A landlord had tried to DIY a sub-panel installation and had cross-wired the neutral and ground buses in a way that was genuinely dangerous. Not the kind of dangerous that might cause a problem eventually, but the kind that could arc and start a fire on any given Tuesday. Caleb spent 4 hours fixing it. He worked carefully, methodically, with the particular focused patience that came from years of doing things where mistakes had consequences that couldn't be undone. He labeled every circuit. He tested every connection. He left the panel cleaner and safer than it had been when the building was new. Roy called while he was packing up. Hey, boss, you hear about that thing on the news, Sterling Dynamics? What about it? Some kind of internal thing? Board, shakeup or something. I didn't really follow it. Jenny had the news on while I was icing my back. But I heard the name and I remembered you did that cafe job on Wabash. Isn't that where their people were having breakfast? I don't know. Anyway, how was the Pilsen job? Landlord almost killed his tenants. The classic. Caleb hung up and sat in the truck. He didn't turn on the news. He didn't search for Sterling Dynamics. He drove to his next job and then to the grocery store and then to school. That night, Maisie wanted to play cards after dinner. They played Go Fish at the kitchen table for 45 minutes, and she won 3 out of 4 games, which she attributed to strategy and which he attributed to the fact that he had a hard time keeping a straight face when she asked if he had any queens, because she always asked about queens, and he always had at least one. "You're terrible at this," she said, collecting her winning pile. "I'm letting you win." "No, you're not. You're just bad at it." "Maybe." She shuffled the cards with the clumsy, determined motions of a person who'd only recently learned how. Half the deck slid off the table. She picked them up without embarrassment. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. Why don't you ever talk about what you used to do before you were an electrician?" The question landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. He looked at her across the table, at her ink-stained fingers and her 2 long bangs that needed cutting and her eyes that were her mother's eyes. "I was a different person," he said, "in a different job." "What kind of job?" "A job where I traveled a lot and helped people with problems." "Like electrical problems?" "Different kinds of problems." "Why'd you stop?" "Because you came along, and I wanted to be here." She thought about this for a moment, the way she thought about everything, set seriously, with her full attention, the same way she'd studied her printmaking tree. "Was it dangerous?" she said. "Sometimes." "Were you good at it?" He looked at her. "Yeah, mice, I was good at it." "Are you good at being an electrician?" "I'm pretty good." "Then it doesn't matter." She put the cards back in the box with an air of finality. "Can I have a mango pouch?" He gave her a mango pouch and she took it to her room, and he sat at the kitchen table listening to the sound of her pulling the cap off and the quiet, content silence that followed. And he thought that she was right. It didn't matter. And also it did, in ways she couldn't understand yet, in the way that the person you used to be is always standing in the room just behind you, not interfering, not helping, just present, like old wiring behind new drywall. On Saturday morning, while Maisie was at a classmate's birthday party, the first one she'd been invited to this year, which was its own complicated thing that Caleb had thoughts about but was choosing not to voice, his phone rang with a number he recognized. Lauren Whitmore. He almost didn't answer. But something, call it instinct, call it the same thing that had made him look at the corner table in the cafe, made him pick up. "Mr. Ryland, I have a situation that requires your attention. Can you come to the Sterling Dynamics building downtown? Today." "No." "Please hear me out. This is not about the cafe incident or the Meridian breach. This is about a security matter, a serious one, and I wouldn't be calling you on a Saturday if it weren't urgent. You have a security department. Our security department is part of the problem. Or it might be. That's what we need to determine." Silence on the line. Caleb could hear faintly the sound of other voices in the background. Tense, clipped. The particular frequency of people dealing with something that's getting worse. "What kind of security matter?" he said. "I can't discuss it on an open line, but I'll tell you this much. It looks like the Meridian breach 3 years ago. The same architecture, the same entry vectors. And this time, we don't have an anonymous specialist working behind the scenes to fix it." He stood in his kitchen, phone to his ear, looking out the window at the street below. A couple was walking a dog. The trees were starting to turn. Maisie's printmaking tree was tacked to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like the state of Illinois. "I'll be there in an hour," he said, and hung up before Lauren could say thank you. The Sterling Dynamics building was on Michigan Avenue, 42 floors of glass and steel that reflected the lake in the mornings and the city lights at night and tried its best to look inevitable, like it had always been there and always would be. Caleb had driven past it plenty of times without looking at it. Buildings like that weren't built for people like him. They were built for the people inside them, to remind those people that they had arrived somewhere worth arriving. He parked in a garage 2 blocks south and walked, hands in his jacket pockets, collar up against the October wind coming off the lake. The lobby was marble and recessed lighting, and a security desk staffed by 2 men in dark uniforms who both straightened when he pushed through the revolving door. He gave his name. One of them made a call. Within 90 seconds, Lauren Whitmore was stepping out of an elevator with her coat still on and her phone in her hand, and the specific expression of someone who had been awake since before it was reasonable to be awake. "Thank you for coming," she said, and she actually meant it. He could tell. "What's the situation?" "Upstairs." She gestured toward the elevator. "I'll explain on the way." They rode to the 38th floor. Lauren talked fast, which he'd noticed was not her natural register. She was a precise, measured speaker, and the speed told him more about the severity of the situation than the words did. 4 hours ago, the company's network monitoring system had flagged an anomaly in the secure data partition that housed the International Contracts Division. Someone was moving through the system laterally, not breaking down doors but opening them carefully, one at a time, the way a person moves through a dark house they half know. The IT security team had identified the intrusion but couldn't isolate its origin without risking tipping off the intruder and causing them to execute whatever payload they'd planted. The largest active contract in the division, the Arcturus project, a multi-government infrastructure initiative worth approximately $1.2 billion, had a certification window that closed in 18 hours. If Sterling Dynamics' secure systems showed evidence of compromise before that window closed, the contracting authority could invoke the security clause and void the agreement. "Your IT team is good enough to spot it, but not to stop it," Caleb said. "Our IT team is good enough to spot it and very, very motivated to point fingers at each other about whose fault it is. By the time they stop arguing about protocol, we'll have lost the contract. And you called me because the last time your company's systems were attacked with this architecture, you fixed it in 48 hours from outside the network with access to roughly a third of what you'd have access to today. That was 3 years ago. You're going to tell me you've forgotten how?" He didn't answer that. The 38th floor was the executive level. Wide corridors, better carpet, the hush of a place where the temperature was always precisely controlled. Lauren led him past a conference room where 3 people were clustered around a laptop, arguing in low, urgent voices, past a row of glass-walled offices, and into a large corner room where Olivia Sterling was standing at the window with her back to the door, looking out at the lake. She turned when they came in. She was wearing the same gray sweater from Friday morning, which told him she'd probably been here since last night. There were 2 other people in the room, a man in his mid-30s with the particular physical tension of someone running on caffeine and anxiety, who was introduced as Deven Kapoor, head of network security, and an older woman named Frances Cho, who was the CFO, and who had the stillness of someone who has lived through enough crises to know that panic doesn't help anything. And Victor Haynes was there. He was standing near the far wall, arms crossed, and when Caleb walked in, something moved across his face that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite contempt. It was the expression of a man who has placed a bet and is watching the table to see how the cards fall. "You brought the electrician," Victor said. He said it to Olivia, not to Caleb, which was a technique, making someone invisible by refusing to address them directly. "I brought a cybersecurity specialist," Olivia said. "Sit down, Victor." "He's not credentialed. He's not vetted. We have protocols for external contractors." Victor. The single word. No heat in it, no volume, but it closed the conversation like a door being shut firmly. Victor sat down. His jaw was tight. His eyes went to Caleb and stayed there, doing their calculation, looking for the angle. Caleb looked at Devin. "Walk me through what you've got." Devin pulled up the monitoring data on the room's main screen. A cascade of network logs, access timestamps, lateral movement indicators. Caleb stood in front of it and read it the way he read electrical schematics, following the logic of the thing, tracing the current through its path. He asked 3 questions. Devin answered them quickly, clearly, the professional responsiveness of someone who's relieved that a person in the room knows what they're talking about. "When did the first anomaly show up?" Caleb said. 3:47 a.m. That's when the monitoring system flagged the initial probe. What partition did it hit first? Vendor credentialing, second tier. Then it moved to contracts. 40 minutes later. Caleb nodded slowly. He'd seen this before. Not this exact attack, but its family. The sequence was recognizable, like a dialect. There was a methodological signature to how the intrusion moved, which side doors it tested first, which ones it passed without trying. Someone had done reconnaissance. Someone had known the architecture before they'd started. This isn't a random attack, Caleb said. We know, Lauren said. Someone who knows your system from the inside designed this. The entry vectors they're trying correspond to gaps that would only be visible if you had access to your own network documentation. The room was quiet. Frances Cho uncrossed and recrossed her legs. Devin looked at his laptop. Olivia, who had been watching Caleb since he walked in, watched him a moment longer before she said, "How quickly can you identify the breach point?" "Couple hours, if I have full access to the logs and clean workstation." "You'll have whatever you need." "I'll need Devin to run point on the internal side. I'm not your employee. I can't authenticate to your systems directly." "Done. And I need everyone who isn't in this room to stop touching the network until I say otherwise. Every login, every remote session, everything. You're giving the intruder data every time someone connects." "That's going to cause operational disruption," Frances said. "The contract voiding is going to cause more." Frances looked at Olivia. Olivia nodded. Frances picked up her phone. Victor unfolded his arms and leaned forward in his chair. "I'd like it noted for the record that I have serious reservations about bringing an outside individual with no verified credentials into direct proximity of our most sensitive data during an active security incident." "Noted," Olivia said. "I'm not finished." "You are, actually." She said it without looking at him. "Devin, set up a workstation for Mr. Ryland, conference room B, and get him whatever he needs." Devin was already moving. Caleb followed him out without looking at Victor. But he felt it. The quality of Victor's attention tracking him across the room, that focused, resentful gaze that wasn't just professional objection. It was something more personal. Something that had been building before the café, before this morning, before any of this became visible. He filed it away and went to work. Conference room B had a long table, a phone that nobody used anymore, and a window that looked at the building next door instead of the lake, which Caleb preferred. He didn't need the view. He needed the screen and the logs and the silence. Devin set up a clean workstation, created a temporary elevated access account with Lauren's authorization, and pulled a chair up next to Caleb's without being asked. He was good at his job, quietly competent in the way that people who actually know what they're doing tend to be, without the performance of competence that the other kind usually substitute for the real thing. "You worked a breach like this before?" Devin said, not looking up from his own screen. "Something similar." "How similar?" Caleb glanced at him. "Similar enough that I know how they're going to move in the next 2 hours before they know it themselves." Devin thought about that. So what are they going to do? They're going to probe the Arcturus partition for another 45 minutes without touching it, testing the edges, making sure the defenses respond the way their intelligence said they would. Then they're going to go quiet for about an hour, look like they've disengaged, try to get you to relax, and then they're going to hit the certification database from the lateral approach they've been building through the vendor credentials. And when they do that, we'll be waiting for them, and we'll know exactly where they came from. Devin nodded. He pulled up a secondary monitoring panel and started configuring a trace architecture that Caleb had to admit was cleaner than what he'd have built from scratch himself. The kid was good. He'd underestimated him, which was a habit he tried not to have and had anyway. They worked in parallel, not talking much, the way people work together when the work is doing the communicating. Caleb opened the log files from the initial probe and read backward through them with the same patience he used on old wiring, not looking for what was wrong, but looking for the shape of what was right, so that the wrong thing would become visible by contrast. He found it at the 40-minute mark. It was small. A half-second timing anomaly and an access request to the vendor credentials partition. Not a failed attempt. A successful one. Someone with legitimate credentials had authenticated to that partition at 3:46 a.m., 11 seconds after the external probe started. The access was brief, unremarkable on its own, but in context it was a door being held open from the inside. He stared at it for a long time. "Devin," he said, "who has level 3 access to the vendor credentialing partition?" Devin pulled up the permissions list. 14 people, IT staff, procurement leads, and 3 executive-level overrides. Which 3 executives? Devin read the names. Caleb listened without expression. Victor Haynes was the 3rd name. He didn't say anything yet. He went back to the logs and looked at the access timestamp again. And then he pulled the VPN records for the same window. And then he pulled the building access logs that Lauren had included in the data package. And he triangulated all 3 data points the way you triangulate a position from multiple imprecise measurements, each one narrowing the possible range until the answer wasn't a range anymore. Victor Haynes' corporate credentials had authenticated to the vendor partition at 3:46 a.m. Victor Haynes had not badged into the building until 8:15 a.m. Victor Haynes' company laptop had a VPN session open from a residential IP address in River North from 3:30 a.m. to 4:20 a.m. Someone sitting at home in River North had used Victor Haynes' credentials to open a door from the inside while an external attacker was testing the external walls. Caleb sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, not seeing it. "I need the last 6 months of access logs," he said. "Everything that touched the Arcturus partition. Every login, every file access, every export." "That's going to be a big pull." "I know. Do it anyway." Devin put in the request. While they waited for the data, Caleb got up and walked to the window and looked at the building next door. A woman on the 22nd floor of the other building was eating lunch at her desk, staring at her own screen. He watched her for a moment without thinking about anything particular. Then he went back to the table. The 6 months of logs came back. It took Caleb 40 minutes to read through them, cross-referencing access patterns with the anomalies he'd identified, building a picture of what had been happening inside Sterling Dynamics' most sensitive data environment over the past half year. What he found was methodical and patient and deeply damaging. Small data exports, always under the threshold that triggered automatic flags. Access at irregular hours, not always the middle of the night, which would have stood out, but at times that were just slightly off, early morning or late evening. Repeated queries of the Arcturus contract specifications, the bidding framework, the technical parameters that a competitor would need to undercut the contract at renewal. All of it tied to a single credential set, moving through the data with the kind of disciplined restraint that comes from knowing exactly where the tripwires are. And every trace went back to Victor Haynes. "He's been doing this for months," Devin said quietly. He'd seen it too. He was staring at his screen with the expression of someone whose understanding of a situation has just revised itself completely downward. At least 6, maybe longer. The logs don't go back further than 6 months on this system. He's selling it to someone. Probably, or trading it. This level of persistence usually means an ongoing relationship, not a one-time transaction. Devin was quiet for a moment. "He's using his own credentials." "Yes. That's..." He stopped. "That's arrogant or stupid. Or both. Or he thought he was the one who'd be in a position to investigate it if it was ever discovered. He's been running security oversight for most of the company's IT operations for the last 8 months. He'd see the flag before anyone else did. Except Ms. Sterling went outside the department. Because the department is headed by someone she now has doubts about. And she called you. She called me." Devin shook his head slowly. "He made a mistake. When the external attack started tonight, he authenticated to prop the door open, and he used his real credentials because they were the ones he had. He didn't have time to route through anything cleaner." That's when people make mistakes. When they're rushing. When they're scared. Scared of what? Caleb looked at the data on the screen. Months of careful, calculated betrayal laid out in log files and timestamps and access records. He needed the attack to succeed tonight. The Arcturus certification window closes in 18 hours. He needed the contract voided. If Sterling loses Arcturus, the company takes a major hit. Board loses confidence in leadership. There's a reorganization. He paused. And in the reorganization, someone has to step up. Someone who's been positioning himself for a while. Devin stared at the screen. He was going to use the attack to move up. Or he was being paid to kill the contract for a competitor, and the reorganization was a bonus. Can you prove all of this? Caleb looked at the data. All of it except the last part. The motive I'm inferring, the mechanics, the timestamps, the credentials, the access pattern, that's in the logs. He reached for his phone and called Lauren's extension. I need you, Olivia, and the CFO in conference room B, and I need Victor Haynes in here too. There was a pause. What did you find? Come down and I'll show you. They came within 4 minutes. Victor came in last, behind Francis Cho, and he looked at the workstation and at the screen and at Caleb's face, and something happened behind his eyes. A rapid internal recalibration, the kind that happens when a person walks into a room and realizes too late that the room is not what they expected. He sat down, arms crossed, expression deliberately neutral. He was good at neutral. He'd been good at a lot of things, for a long time. Caleb stood at the head of the table and walked them through it. He didn't editorialize. He showed them the data, the timestamps, the VPN records, the access logs, the export history, and he explained what each piece meant and how they connected, the way he'd explain a wiring diagram to a homeowner. Clear, sequential, without condescension. He let the information make its own case. He had been talking for about 8 minutes when Victor said, "That's circumstantial." "Which part?" Caleb said. "All of it. You're building an inferential narrative from access logs. My credentials could have been compromised. Someone could be using them without my knowledge. Someone using your credentials would need your MFA token, which is a physical device assigned to you. Devices can be cloned. At 3:46 in the morning from your home IP address." Victor's jaw tightened. "The VPN session originated from the network registered to your apartment in River North," Caleb said. "Not a VPN, not a proxy, not a relay. Your home internet connection. You authenticated from your couch." The room was very quiet. Francis Cho had her hands folded on the table and was looking at them. Olivia was looking at Victor. Lauren had a legal pad in front of her and a pen in her hand and had not written anything. "This is a setup," Victor said. His voice had changed register, not louder, but rougher, the smoothness stripped away. "He's been in our systems for 2 hours with full access. You don't think it's possible that he planted?" "The logs were time-stamped before I arrived," Devin said. Quietly, but clearly. "I've been watching the data environment the whole time. He hasn't touched the timestamps. He can't. They're cryptographically sealed at the infrastructure level. No one outside the hosting provider can alter them without breaking the hash chain." Victor looked at Devin. It was the first time he'd really looked at Devin since the meeting started, and it had the quality of a man realizing that someone he'd considered furniture had been watching him the whole time. "You built your career here on someone else's trust," Olivia said. Not loudly, not with any particular heat. "The way you state a fact that doesn't require emphasis because its weight is self-evident. 8 years. I promoted you twice. I defended you when people on this board wanted you out. Olivia, don't." She said it the same way she'd said sit down. Simple, definitive. "Lauren, I want legal and the board chair on the phone in the next 15 minutes. Francis, I need you to call the Arcturus Contracting Authority and let them know we've identified and contained a security incident before any breach of contract data occurred. Devin?" She looked at him. "Good work." Devin looked surprised, then carefully not surprised. Victor stood up. The movement was sudden, unplanned, the physical expression of a person whose internal structure has failed and who doesn't know what to do with their body. He looked at the screen with the data still displayed on it. He looked at Lauren. He looked at Caleb. You, he said. Just the word, like an accusation in a language with only one sound. Sit down, Caleb said. You walked in here with your toolbox and your worn-out boots and you walked through everything I built. Sit down, Victor. I've been here 8 years. I have relationships on 3 continents. I know this company better than anyone in this room and better than some girl who inherited. He reached across the table for the workstation, for the evidence drive that Devin had been compiling the logs onto. And he was fast, faster than someone who spent most of their time in conference rooms usually was. His hand closed on it. Caleb was already moving. It wasn't dramatic. No part of it was. He caught Victor's wrist with one hand and applied pressure to a specific point. Ulnar nerve, nothing permanent, nothing that would leave a mark. And Victor's grip released the drive reflexively before his brain had time to override the physical signal. Caleb's other hand caught the drive before it hit the table. He stepped back. Victor stared at his own hand, at the fingers that had opened without his permission. Don't, Caleb said, and it had the same quality as what he'd said in the café. 3 syllables this time instead of 3 words, but identical in its lack of anger, its complete and measured control. Victor sat down. Not because he chose to, because the alternative required a confrontation he now understood, viscerally and completely, he was not equipped to have. The security team arrived 4 minutes after Lauren made the call. 2 of them, both people who'd been with the company long enough to look visibly uncomfortable escorting a man whose parking spot was better than theirs. Victor stood when they came in, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the door with the careful dignity of a man trying to exit a burning building without running. At the threshold, he stopped, without looking back. I'll have my attorney contact you, he said. It was addressed to no one in particular, or to all of them, or to the room. Nobody responded. He left. The door didn't slam. It swung shut on its pneumatic closer with a controlled, expensive sound, the kind of closure that buildings like this one were designed to produce, measured, contained, suggesting that whatever had just happened was already being absorbed and processed and filed away. Caleb set the evidence drive on the table in front of Devin. Keep that somewhere that isn't this room, he said. Devin took it. The next 40 minutes were procedural, calls being made, notifications going out, the machinery of consequence beginning to move. Caleb sat in the corner of the conference room and drank water from a glass someone had put in front of him and watched the process, the way he watched most things happening around him, with attention, without participation. He'd done the part he came to do. The rest was other people's work. Olivia came to sit beside him at some point during those 40 minutes, while Lauren was on a call in the corner and Francis was talking in low, rapid sentences to the board chair on speaker. She didn't say anything immediately. She sat in the chair 2 down from his and looked at the table. Thank you, she said finally. Devin did most of the technical work. Devin knows that's not true. So do I. She paused. How did you know it was Victor? I didn't. Not at first. The data knew. I just read it. She turned to look at him. She had the look of someone who wants to ask several things at once and is deciding which one actually matters. When the board meets on this, she said, and they will, probably in the next 36 hours, they're going to want to know about you. Who you are, what your background is, how you came to be sitting in this building today. I won't be able to give them the electrician answer. You can give them whatever answer is accurate. Which is? Caleb looked at the window, at the building next door, at the woman on the 22nd floor, who was no longer eating lunch. The afternoon had shifted while he wasn't watching, the light going flatter, the gray of the sky deepening toward the darker gray of late afternoon. There are things about my background that aren't mine to share, he said. Not because I'm protecting myself, because there are other people involved, operations that were classified, people whose safety depends on those things staying classified. He paused. What I can tell you is that before I was an electrician, I served, for a long time. And some of the things I learned during that time are relevant to what I did here today. The rest of it stays where it is. Olivia was quiet for a moment. Navy, she said. He didn't answer. There was a commendation in a personnel record that Lauren found when she was tracing the Meridian contractor chain. It was redacted, but the format was consistent with certain kinds of military service awards. The ones they give for things they can't describe. Lauren is thorough. I pay her to be. He looked at her. She looked back. She wasn't pushing, not really. She was doing the thing she'd done in the cafe. Sitting with the information, not forcing it into a shape before it was ready. I made a choice, he said, a few years ago. There was a situation where I could protect my team and take an action that would end my ability to continue serving, or I could follow the order and lose people. He said it plainly, without dramatizing it. I chose the team, and I came home. And built a life. Tried to. You did. I'm working on it. She smiled at that. A small one, real. The kind that doesn't happen when you're thinking about making it happen. The board is going to want to offer you something, she said. A formal position, something that compensates you properly for what you've done today and 3 years ago. That's for later. I know, I'm just telling you it's coming. She stood up. Is your daughter at the birthday party still? He checked his watch. The party had ended at 2. He'd arranged for Maisie to go back to the host family's house until he could pick her up, the kind of favor that parents traded with each other in the loose network of school acquaintances. He owed the Garcias something now, probably a reciprocal Saturday, probably involving a 6-year-old who ate everything and would need to be reminded about indoor voices. I need to get her, he said. Go. We have what we need. He stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Caleb, Olivia said, and the first name landed differently than anything else had. Not formal, not performative, just direct, the way she'd looked at him across the spreadsheet in the cafe before any of this had happened. What you just did, identifying it, stopping it, keeping Victor from destroying the evidence. You did all of that with less than 2 hours of access, in a system you'd never worked in, for a company you have no obligation to. You called me. You came. He looked at her for a moment. Then he put on his jacket. You'd better call the Arcturus Contracting Authority before the close of business today, he said. Get ahead of it. If they hear about a security incident through a channel you don't control, it's a harder conversation. Lauren's already on it. Good. He picked up his phone from the table. I'll send you an invoice. He walked out of the conference room and down the wide hallway and into the elevator. He rode it down 40 floors, listening to the soft mechanical sounds of a building doing its job. Cables, counterweights, the controlled physics of ascent and descent. The lobby was marble and light, and the security desk where he'd given his name that morning, and the revolving door, and the street. He walked the 2 blocks to the garage in the October cold, and he got in his truck, and he drove north toward Pilsen to pick up his daughter from the Garcia house, and the radio was on low, some sports talk he wasn't listening to, and the city moved around him the way cities do on Saturday afternoons, loose, unhurried, people doing the ordinary things that ordinary Saturdays call for. His phone buzzed. A text from the number he'd saved under Lauren. Board wants to meet Monday morning, 9 a.m. I'll send the address. He read it at a red light. He did not reply. He drove to pick up Maisie, and she came out of the Garcia house with paint-stained fingers. Not from school this time, just from a craft project the kids had done. And she got in the truck and buckled her seatbelt and said, Can we get pizza? Sure. The kind with the crispy edges? Is there another kind? She thought about it seriously, in the way she thought about everything. No, she said finally. I don't think there is. He pulled away from the curb. Through the windshield, the city spread out in front of them, the skyline in the rear-view mirror going smaller by degrees. And he drove toward pizza and away from everything else, the way a man who has chosen his life will always turn, toward the small, specific, irreplaceable thing rather than the large, complicated one. For now, that was enough. The pizza place was on Diversey, a spot with red vinyl booths and a counter where you ordered and a chalkboard menu that hadn't meaningfully changed since the 80s. The kind of place that survived not because it was fashionable, but because it was consistent. The crust was always crispy at the edges, the sauce was always too sweet, and nobody ever asked you if everything was tasting great tonight. Caleb had been coming here since he moved to Avondale, first alone while Maisie was with the sitter in the evenings, then with her when she got old enough to sit in a booth without incident. She ate 3 slices, which was one more than usual, And she talked about the birthday party with the detailed, slightly exhausting thoroughness of a 7-year-old who had processed a significant social event and needed to externalize all of it. There had been a piñata. The piñata had been shaped like a dinosaur. It had taken 11 kids and a modified approach involving a broom handle to bring it down, and Maisie had gotten a handful of Skittles and a temporary tattoo of a butterfly that she showed him on the inside of her left wrist. "It'll come off in a few days," she said, studying it. "Probably. I want to keep it." "You can want things." She gave him the look. "That's not a yes. It's not a no either." She ate her last slice considering this distinction, apparently decided it was satisfactory, and asked for a soda, which he said no to, which she accepted without the negotiation that might have followed on a different evening. She was tired. The day had taken something out of her that she was still tallying. They drove home in the comfortable quiet of people who don't need to fill the space. That night, after she was asleep, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water he didn't drink and thought about Monday morning. He thought about the board meeting the way he thought about electrical problems he hadn't seen yet. From the outside in, working through what was visible toward what was causing it, building a picture from inference when direct observation wasn't available. Victor Haynes would be lawyered up by morning. He had the resources for it and the arrogance to believe a good enough attorney could restructure what was on those logs into something defensible. The evidence was solid. Caleb had made sure of that, checking and rechecking the chain of custody before he left the building. But solid evidence and a clean resolution were different things, and he'd been around enough institutional processes to know that the machinery of consequence moved at its own pace, regardless of how clear the facts were. He did not feel satisfied. He wasn't sure what he felt exactly. He'd done what needed doing, the way he'd always done what needed doing, and now it was in other people's hands, which was the correct outcome. That was how it was supposed to work. You identify the problem, fix what can be fixed, hand off what can't, and move to the next thing. The next thing was Monday morning. He went to bed. Sunday was quiet. Maisie had a play date with a girl from her class named Priya, whose mother called 3 hours in advance to confirm, and then called again 20 minutes before the scheduled time to reconfirm, which Caleb found mildly exhausting but understood, because raising a kid by yourself made you thorough about logistics in ways that two-parent households sometimes didn't have to be. He dropped Maisie at Priya's apartment in Lincoln Square and spent 3 hours doing the administrative work of running a solo business. Invoices, a supplier order, a follow-up email to the Wicker Park restaurant build-out, and a detailed estimate for a job in Evanston that he'd been putting off because the scope description kept changing. He drove to the Elan job and back, not for any reason, just because he was in the neighborhood. He parked across the street for a moment and looked at the café. Sunday morning crowd, gentler than the Tuesday one. The window where he'd sat was occupied by 2 women with laptops, and the corner table where Olivia's group had been was pushed against the wall to make room for a family with a stroller. The cafe looked exactly like itself. Nothing about it suggested that anything significant had happened there 6 days ago. He drove home. That evening, he called Roy to walk him through the work schedule for the next 2 weeks, leaving Monday morning blocked out without explaining why. Roy, whose back was improving, didn't ask. Roy was good at not asking, which was a quality Caleb valued in people generally and in his only employee specifically. Monday came the way Mondays do, abruptly, with weather. It was raining when he dropped Maisie at school, the kind of rain that couldn't decide whether to commit to being serious or stay at a drizzle and ended up doing both at once, so that you needed an umbrella but felt vaguely embarrassed carrying one. Maisie wore her yellow slicker and took the 5 steps from the truck to the entrance at a run and didn't look back. He watched the doors close. He drove downtown. The Sterling Dynamics building was different at 9 on a Monday morning than it had been on a Saturday afternoon. The lobby traffic was purposeful and dense, people moving in and out of the revolving doors with the focused momentum of a workday beginning. He gave his name at the security desk. This time, both guards recognized it. He could tell by the slight adjustment in their manner, the micro shift between processing a guest and processing someone who mattered to the people upstairs. Lauren met him at the elevator again, same coat, different shoes. "How are you?" she said. "Fine. How's it going with Victor?" His attorney contacted us late yesterday, requesting discovery of the evidence package before any board presentation. That's standard. Yes. We declined. Also standard. He has until close of business today to respond to the termination notice before we proceed to formal reporting. She walked quickly, same pace as Saturday. The board chair has seen the preliminary evidence summary. She paused, choosing the word, shaken. How long had Victor been on the board's radar as a leadership candidate? 2 years. He was positioning for a VP of operations role that would have been created in the next reorganization. A number of board members were supportive. Did those board members have any financial relationship with the Arcturus project? Lauren stopped walking. She looked at him. That's a specific question. It's an inference from the pattern. If Victor was moving data to a competitor, he needed a reason to believe the competitor could use it to win Arcturus away from Sterling. That's only valuable if the Arcturus contract is actually at risk of rebidding, which would only be true if someone on the inside was creating conditions for a new bidding cycle. Lauren's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A slight tightening, the look of a lawyer confronting a possibility she'd already considered but hadn't yet spoken aloud. I'm going to need more time with the logs, she said. I know. The board presentation is in 40 minutes. Then ask Devin to pull the board members' financial disclosure forms from the last 3 years and flag any relationship to competing infrastructure contractors. You don't have to surface it in the meeting today, but you need to know what's there before the meeting ends. Lauren looked at him for another moment, then pulled out her phone and made a call as they walked. She was talking to Devin before they'd reached the conference room. The boardroom was on the 40th floor, 2 floors above where Caleb had worked on Saturday. It was larger than Conference Room B, more deliberate in its architecture. A long, oval table in dark wood, chairs upholstered in something that looked like leather, and probably was, windows that ran the full width of the room and showed the lake in the distance, flat and gray under the rain. 7 people were already seated when Caleb came in with Lauren, and 2 more were on a video conference screen at the far end. He registered the room the way he registered all rooms. 6 men, 1 woman besides Olivia. Average age mid to late 50s, with 1 outlier in his late 30s who had the careful, eager stillness of someone who was newer to the table than he felt comfortable admitting. The board chair was a man named Gerald Forsyth, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the face of someone who had made and survived several significant decisions and was about to make another one. He looked at Caleb when he entered and held the look for a moment in a way that wasn't unfriendly but wasn't warm. Olivia was at the head of the table. She looked like she'd slept in the last 48 hours, but not a lot. She had her pen, and she was not clicking it. She nodded when Caleb came in. He sat in the chair Lauren indicated, against the wall rather than at the table. Technically, an observer's position, which suited him. He hadn't been invited to run the meeting. He was there to answer questions if questions were asked, and to watch, because watching rooms like this one was something he'd never entirely stopped knowing how to do. Olivia opened the presentation. She walked the board through the timeline. The initial anomaly, the call to Lauren, the decision to bring in an outside specialist, Caleb's identification of the breach pattern, the evidence chain connecting the intrusion to Victor's credentials, Victor's attempt to destroy the evidence drive, and the current status of the formal proceedings. She was precise and clear, and she didn't minimize anything, including the uncomfortable fact that she had promoted Victor twice and defended him from board-level scrutiny on at least 2 occasions that she described specifically. Gerald Forsyth asked most of the questions. They were good questions, focused, sequential, pressing on the points where inference required additional support. Caleb answered 3 of them directly when Olivia deferred to him, keeping his answers short and specific, the way you brief someone who needs information without needing to understand the methodology behind it. The younger board member, introduced as Thomas Park, no relation to Dennis Park at the café, asked the question Caleb had been expecting. Mr. Ryland, can you walk us through your professional background? You're an electrician, based on the service records from Elan Café, but clearly you have skills well beyond electrical work. I have a varied background, Caleb said. Could you be more specific? Some of it is, legally speaking, specific in ways I can't detail publicly. I served in the military for 11 years. Some of that service involved work that required security clearances that don't expire with the service itself. I'm constrained by that, not by choice, but by obligation. Thomas looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at Caleb with the expression of a man calculating the distance between what he was being told and what he actually needed to know. Your involvement Saturday, Gerald said. You isolated a sophisticated cyber attack in under 2 hours and identified one of our executives as the insider threat. That's not a level of capability that... I've done similar work before, Caleb said, in other contexts. For whom? I can't answer that. Gerald sat back. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was evaluative. The particular quality of a room full of decision-makers deciding what to do with information that didn't fit the usual categories. You also, Gerald said, stopped Victor Haynes from destroying the evidence drive. Physically. I prevented him from removing it from the room, yes. Using what appeared to witnesses to be a nerve compression technique. I used the minimum effective intervention, which you knew how to apply. Yes. Gerald looked at Olivia. She looked back at him with an expression that said she'd already made her assessment and didn't feel the need to defend it further. There was a lot in that exchange. Years of a professional relationship, the specific grammar of people who have disagreed productively many times, the mutual recognition that the conversation happening right now was happening on top of a longer one. Lauren has prepared materials, Olivia said, redirecting. The evidence package, chain of custody documentation, and the formal termination notice served to Mr. Haynes this morning. If the board approves, we'll be filing a criminal referral with the appropriate authorities by end of business today. The board approved, unanimously, which moved faster than Caleb expected, though he supposed that when the evidence was this clear, and the alternative was defending a man who'd tried to grab a drive full of his own crimes in front of witnesses, the calculus simplified. What came next was the part Caleb had been waiting for without exactly looking forward to. Gerald Forsyth set down his pen and looked at Caleb with the directness of a man who'd gotten where he was by not circling things. We'd like to offer you a position, he said, Chief of Global Security. It's a role we've been planning to create for 18 months, and we haven't been able to find the right person because the right person for a role like that is not someone you usually find through a recruiter. The base compensation would be... I appreciate it, Caleb said. No. Gerald blinked. You haven't heard the number. The number isn't the issue. Then what is? Caleb looked at the oval table, at the 9 faces around it. Curious, uncertain, some of them visibly surprised by the speed of the refusal. He looked at Olivia, who was watching him with the particular expression she'd had outside Roosevelt Elementary on Friday morning, that quality of attention that was different from the other's attention in that it wasn't trying to categorize him. I made a promise, he said, after I left service, to my daughter and to myself, that I was done with the kind of work that takes you away from your life for weeks at a time and puts you in rooms like this one on a permanent basis. I fixed wiring. I built something small and uncomplicated, and I did it deliberately, and I'm not willing to trade that for a salary and a title, regardless of what the salary is. The room was quiet. Thomas Park, to his credit, didn't push. The older board members exchanged glances. The specific glance of people who have wanted things for so long they've forgotten what it looks like when someone genuinely doesn't. That's it, Gerald said. Not dismissively. He seemed to actually want to understand. That's it? Gerald looked at Olivia. She was still watching Caleb. There's an alternative proposal on the table, she said. I put it together Saturday evening, which tells you I was fairly confident he was going to say no to the first one. She pulled a single page from the folder in front of her and slid it down the table to Caleb. Independent security consultant retained by Sterling Dynamics on a project basis. No offices here, no mandatory attendance, no quarterly reviews. You work when there's a problem worth your attention. You define the scope, you set the hours, you name the rate. You remain self-employed. Your life stays yours. Caleb picked up the page. He read it. It was short. A single page, which was itself a kind of statement. Lauren had probably drafted it, but the structure was Olivia's. Direct, no unnecessary language, everything that needed to be there and nothing that didn't. The rate is too high, he said. It's the market rate for this level of work. I don't need the market rate. Then think of it as corrective compensation for the Meridian breach 3 years ago. I was paid for the Meridian breach. You were paid $40,000 to prevent a billion-dollar loss. The rate is not negotiable. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the steady, unblinking patience of a person who has decided something and is simply waiting for the other party to arrive at the same conclusion. The board was watching them both. Gerald Forsyth, Caleb noticed, was fighting what might have been a smile. Project basis only, Caleb said. No retainer. I invoice by the job. Done. If I'm in the middle of other work, I determine priority. Done. And you don't call on school nights. A very small pause. Not uncertainty. Caleb could tell the difference by now between Olivia pausing to calculate and Olivia pausing because something caught her off guard. This was the second kind. Agreed, she said. He set the page down. I'll have Lauren send my own contract. Shorter than hers. I look forward to it. Gerald Forsyth cleared his throat in the way of someone who is concluding a meeting and is doing it cheerfully. Is there anything else we need from Mr. Ryland today? No, Olivia said. Then I'd like to take a moment to say, on behalf of this board, that we are very grateful for what you did Saturday, for the company and for our people. That kind of judgment, under that kind of pressure, is... He searched for the word briefly. Rare. Devin Kapoor did solid work, Caleb said. He kept the network environment clean while I was reading the logs. Without that, it would have been harder. He should be on your radar. Gerald looked at Olivia. She made a small note on her pad without commenting. Caleb stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. On the video conference screen, one of the two remote board members, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and very direct eyes, leaned toward her camera. Mr. Ryland, one question if you don't mind. Sure. When you were in that room on Saturday with Victor making the argument that the evidence was planted, that you had done it, there must have been a moment when you knew this could go sideways, that it could look bad for you regardless of what the logs showed. Why did you stay? Caleb thought about it, not performing the thinking, actually doing it, sitting with the question for a moment the way it deserved. Because the problem wasn't solved yet, he said, and I don't leave problems half solved. She nodded slowly. Thank you. He left. He rode down 40 floors in the elevator and crossed the marble lobby and pushed through the revolving door into the rain, which had upgraded its commitment while he was inside, and was now clearly, unapologetically rain. He'd left his jacket at the truck. He walked the 2 blocks getting wet and didn't particularly care. In the truck, he dried his face on his sleeve and sat for a minute. His phone showed a missed call from Roy, probably about the Wicker Park job, and a text from the Evanston client asking whether they could push the estimate to next week, and a photo from Maisie's teacher of the class working on a new project. Some kind of collage, from what he could see, involving magazine cutouts and colored paper. Maisie was in the corner of the frame, bent over her table, deeply focused, not looking at the camera. He looked at the photo for a long time. There was something about the way she bent over work that she cared about, the particular angle of her shoulders, the slight forward lean, that he recognized, not from himself but from her mother, from the way Emma used to sit at the kitchen table grading papers in the evenings, bent forward in the same angle, inhabiting the work completely. He'd sat across from her 100 times and watched it without knowing he was memorizing it, storing it away somewhere in himself that he didn't have language for, in the way that you accumulate people without meaning to, the way they become part of your architecture, whether they stay in your life or not. Emma had been gone for 3 years. A car accident on I-90 in February, ice on the bridge, the kind of thing that happens and that you spend the rest of your life not knowing what to do with. He didn't talk about it, not to clients, not to Roy, not to the parents at school pickup who asked with genuine kindness whether he was co-parenting or how the custody arrangement worked. Questions he answered briefly and rerouted. Maisie knew her mother was dead. She was old enough to know it and young enough that she held the knowledge differently than he did, with a child's particular kind of sadness, which was real but not constant, present but permeable. Grief that surfaced and receded and didn't yet carry the adult weight of permanence. He carried that weight for both of them. That was the deal he'd made with himself, though he hadn't articulated it in those terms. He carried the hard parts so she could still run toward things, so she could still run toward school doors without looking back, so she could lose herself in printmaking and birthday piñatas and the serious business of deciding whether Go Fish was a game of strategy or luck. He started the truck. On the drive back north, his phone rang through the speakers. Lauren Whitmore. "I pulled the board financial disclosures," she said, without preamble. "And?" "Two board members have indirect investment relationships with a company called Meridian Bridge Group, which is a consortium that includes one of the primary competing bidders for the Arcturus contract. The investments are disclosed. They're technically not a conflict under the current bylaws, but they're significant." "How significant?" "7 figures each, combined." Caleb drove for a moment. The rain had thinned to something between drizzle and intention. "That's not a coincidence," he said. "No. It's also not necessarily actionable without more evidence. They'd argue the investments are passive, diversified, legally disclosed, but they had a financial interest in a scenario where Arcturus went back to bid, which is exactly the scenario that Victor was creating." "Yes." "Were they the ones who blocked the VP of Operations restructuring before? The ones who kept Victor in the director position where he had data access but not board access?" Silence on the line. Then, "I'm going to need more time with this." "Take it, but don't let it sit." He paused. "Did you know about the investments before today?" "I knew they existed. I didn't connect them to this." "Now you have." "Yes." Another pause. "You built this out pretty fast from a single inference in a hallway." "Pattern recognition. It's most of what I do." "Is it what you did in the military?" "In a different form." "Can I ask you something off the record?" "You can ask." "Were you ever going to come in from the outside, from the electrician life, before any of this happened?" He thought about it honestly. "No." "Why not?" "Because the electrician life is what I built, and what you build on purpose has to mean something, or you built it for the wrong reason." "But you came in today." "That was a specific thing, in a specific circumstance. It doesn't change what the electrician life is." She was quiet for a moment. "I'll be in touch about the contract. Send it to this number." "It's a cell phone." "I know." He ended the call and merged onto the expressway heading north. The rain was letting up. Through the clearing, the skyline was visible in the rearview mirror, the tower tops catching what pale light the sky was offering, and the lake beyond it, flat and enormous and indifferent to all of it, in the way that very large things are indifferent. He had a job in Logan Square at 2 o'clock. A panel upgrade, straightforward work, the kind he could do efficiently and correctly and leave the place better than he found it. He had groceries to pick up before 3:15. He was out of coffee and nearly out of those fruit pouches, and he needed to remember to check whether the blue jacket needed dry cleaning, because Maisie had a field trip on Thursday that the permission slip, which he had signed and returned, indicated might involve mud. He got off the expressway. He drove through his neighborhood. He parked in front of a building where a family had been without reliable power to 3 of their circuits for 2 weeks, and he got out of the truck with his toolbox, and he went to fix it. The work was quiet and careful, and took exactly as long as it needed to take. When he was done, the circuits were clean, the panel was correctly labeled, and the family, a couple in their 30s and a small boy who kept appearing in the doorway to watch, had power to the kitchen outlets, the basement, and the upstairs hallway for the first time since September. The woman who let him in shook his hand at the end with both of hers and said, "Thank you." "Really? We've been dealing with this for weeks." "It's fixed now," he said. "The load's better balanced. You shouldn't have any more trips." "What do we do if it happens again?" "Call me." He gave her a card. The card said Ryland Electric and had a phone number and nothing else. No website, no tagline, no logo. Just the name and the number, which was all anyone needed to reach him, which was all the card needed to say. He drove to the grocery store. He bought coffee and mango pouches and milk and a bag of potatoes because he'd been meaning to make soup and kept forgetting. He stood in the checkout line and thought about nothing in particular, which was not nothing. It was something he'd worked at. The ability to stand in a grocery store line and simply stand there without the back of his brain running tactical assessments. without the old training pulling his attention to the exits and the sightlines and the people who weren't behaving quite like they should. He drove to Roosevelt Elementary. Maisie came out at 3:17, 2 minutes late again, same as always, because she was always the last one finishing something and she'd never once seemed concerned about it. She had the collage in her hand. He'd seen it in the photo, but in person it was larger than he'd expected. Built on a piece of poster board, a dense layering of colored paper and cutout images and hand-drawn elements that worked in a way he couldn't fully explain and that she'd clearly spent a long time on. She got in the truck, buckled her belt, and showed it to him. "We had to pick a theme," she said. "Mine is things that are hard to see but still there." He looked at the collage. There were cutouts of deep ocean water, of night sky, of tree roots exposed under eroded soil, of fog over mountains. There were small, hand-drawn figures that might have been people, scattered throughout, some visible and some half-hidden behind the layered paper. "What made you pick that?" he said. She shrugged the way she shrugged things. Seriously, considered, not casual. "Because those things are harder to draw, and I wanted to do something hard." He looked at the collage a moment longer. Then he looked at her, sitting in the passenger seat with the poster board on her lap, her ink-stained hands and her slightly too long bangs, and her butterfly temporary tattoo fading at the edges now, barely visible. "It's really good, Mai," he said. "I know," she said, which made him laugh. A real one, short and surprised. And she smiled at that, the quick, bright smile she kept mostly for him. The one that looked like Emma and nothing like Emma at the same time, because the person it came from was entirely and completely her own. He drove them home. That night, after dinner, he taped the collage to the wall beside the printmaking tree. They stood and looked at it together for a moment, the two pieces side by side. The tree in its blue-black ink, bold and slightly crooked, and the collage with its layered depth and its half-hidden figures. "They go together," Maisie said. "Yeah," he said. "They do." She went to brush her teeth. He stood in front of the wall a moment longer. Things that are hard to see, but still there. He turned off the light. 3 weeks passed before Caleb heard from Olivia again. In those 3 weeks, the following things happened. Victor Haynes was formally arrested on charges of corporate espionage and wire fraud, his attorney releasing a statement calling the evidence circumstantial that nobody found particularly convincing, given that the evidence was, in fact, extensive and well documented. The 2 board members with investment ties to Meridian Bridge Group resigned quietly, the kind of quiet that comes with a negotiated exit and a non-disclosure agreement, and the tacit understanding that the alternative was considerably worse. Lauren Whitmore spent most of those 3 weeks in depositions, contract reviews, and what she described in a brief text to Caleb as the most tedious 3 weeks of my professional life, which he took to mean things were progressing correctly. The Arcturus contract was certified on schedule, 18 hours after Caleb left the building that Saturday, the contracting authority having been satisfied by Olivia's direct call and the documentation that the breach had been identified and neutralized before any contract data was compromised. Devin Kapoor was promoted. Caleb saw it in a brief news item about Sterling Dynamics' internal restructuring that Roy forwarded him with no comment, which was Roy's way of saying he'd been following the story and had opinions about it that he was choosing not to voice. Caleb texted back a thumbs up and went back to the panel upgrade he was working on. The consulting contract arrived from Lauren's office on a Thursday afternoon, 12 pages, which was 8 fewer than he'd expected, which meant she'd actually listened when he said shorter. He read it that evening at the kitchen table while Maisie was doing homework across from him, and he made 4 small changes with a pen, scanned it, and sent it back the same night. Lauren replied at 11:15 p.m. with accepted all 4 changes, which told him she'd been waiting for it and probably should have gone to sleep earlier. He signed the final version on a Friday, which felt like a coincidence, but probably wasn't. Lauren was too precise to let things land on coincidental days without meaning to. The work in those 3 weeks was ordinary in the best sense of the word. A full rewire on a 2-flat in Pilsen, where the original knob and tube had been lurking inside the walls like a slow emergency for 40 years. The Evanston estimate that had been rescheduled twice finally happened, and the scope turned out to be interesting. A historic house with layered electrical systems from 4 different decades, each one installed by someone who'd done their best with what they had, leaving behind a kind of archaeological record of how the building had been lived in. He spent 2 days planning the approach before he touched a single wire. Roy, whose back had returned to operational status, helped with the physical work, and they fell into the easy rhythm of two people who'd worked together long enough to not need to narrate everything. He took Maisie to the Science Museum on the field trip because 2 other parents had canceled and the teacher had sent a note asking if any remaining parents could come, and he'd rearranged 2 appointments to be there. They spent 45 minutes in the electricity exhibit, which Maisie found interesting in the abstract and Caleb found interesting in the specific way of someone who'd spent 15 years understanding electricity as a living, dangerous, useful thing, rather than a series of demonstrations in glass cases. She asked a question about lightning that he answered more thoroughly than she'd expected, and she looked at him with the particular expression she used when she discovered a new layer of him. Not surprised exactly, just updating her picture, the way you add detail to a drawing that's mostly done. "How do you know all that?" she said. "It's my job." "No, but how do you know the science part? The physics part?" "I studied it." "In school?" "In school and after." She turned this over. They were standing in front of a Van de Graaff generator, and a museum staffer was asking for volunteers to touch it, and Maisie was pretending she wasn't interested when she clearly was. "You should go up," he said. "My hair will do the thing." "Yeah, everyone will look at me." "For about 30 seconds, then they'll look at something else." She thought about it. Then she raised her hand and the museum staffer brought her up, and the static charge lifted her hair in every direction, and she stood there in front of 40 people with her arms spread and her hair electric and her face in an expression that was half embarrassed and half delighted. And Caleb took a photo on his phone because he knew she'd want it later, even though she'd pretend not to. He was thinking about that photo 3 weeks after the board meeting, on a Tuesday morning, when his phone rang with Olivia's number. He answered it on the 3rd ring. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, "and I decided I'd rather do it in person than in a message, if you have time this week." "What kind of something?" "Not a crisis. Nothing you need to fix. There are things that happened after you left that you should probably know about, and I'd rather tell you over coffee than over the phone." "Elan?" he said. A pause. "That seems right, actually." They met on a Wednesday morning, 9 o'clock. The café was in its ordinary Tuesday configuration. Caleb's brain still wanted to call it Tuesday, because that was what it had been when this began. Moderate crowd, low music, the barista with the moth tattoo who recognized him and poured a drip coffee without being asked, which he paid for in cash and appreciated without saying so. Olivia was already there when he arrived. She was at a small table near the window, not the corner table, not the counter stool, but a middle ground table for 2 that was as close to neutral territory as the cafe had to offer. She had a coffee in front of her and her coat on the back of the chair and her hair down. She looked like someone who had slept recently and more than once, which was an improvement over the last few times he'd seen her. He sat down. "Victor pleaded out," she said, without preamble, which he'd come to understand was her natural register when she wasn't in a room that required her to perform certainty. 60 days ago, his attorney was calling the evidence circumstantial. Yesterday, he accepted a plea agreement. 32 months, federal minimum security, full restitution. How much restitution? The negotiated figure is $4.1 million. It covers the estimated value of the data he sold and the indirect cost of the security measures we had to implement after the breach was discovered. It won't fully compensate the company, but it's what a man with his assets can realistically pay. Who is he selling to? A company called Crestline Analytics. It's a subsidiary of a larger infrastructure group that was positioning to bid against us on Arcturus and 2 other government contracts. The federal case against Crestline is ongoing. Their senior acquisition team is cooperating. Lauren says the domino effect could take down 3 or 4 other companies before it's done. And the board members resigned with no admission of wrongdoing, which is legal speak for "we know what you did and you know we know, and we're all going to pretend the exit was voluntary." So she said it with the specific flatness of someone who is not pretending to be more satisfied with that outcome than they are. Their investment positions in Meridian Bridge Group are being reviewed as part of the federal investigation. Whether that leads anywhere is out of my hands. Caleb turned the coffee mug in his hands. And Devin? That landed differently. She almost smiled. He's good. He's very good, actually. He was already good before all of this, and I didn't see it clearly enough because Victor kept him in a box. He's heading the rebuilt security division now. He's already made 3 structural changes that our previous setup should have had years ago. He'll be a problem for you eventually. She raised an eyebrow. A problem how? He'll get too good to stay. Someone will offer him more than you're paying him. I'm paying him considerably more than I was. Pay him more than that. She looked at him across the table. Is that a professional recommendation? It's an observation. People who are genuinely good at things have options. If you want them to choose you, you have to keep making that a choice worth making. She was quiet for a moment, her coffee cup held in both hands. Outside the window, the city was doing what Chicago does in November, moving quickly, collars up, the trees stripped down to their structural winter selves, spare and clear-lined against a sky the color of old pewter. I owe you an apology, she said. A better one than the one I gave you on the sidewalk. You already apologized. I apologized for what Victor did. I didn't apologize for what I did, which was sit at that table for too long before I intervened. I heard the way he was talking to you, and I ran the calculation, corporate calculation, optics calculation. Is this going to resolve itself before it becomes a thing calculation? And I let it go on longer than I should have. You were a person being humiliated in a public space, and I treated it like a management problem. He looked at her. People do that. I know. I'm still apologizing for it. He accepted the apology the way he accepted most things, not dismissing it, not making it larger than it was. You came to the school, he said, on a Friday morning with 2 cups of coffee. That was something. That was the least I could do. It was more than most people would have. She set down her cup. She looked out the window for a moment, at the street, at the passers-by bundled against the November cold, at the ordinary Tuesday, Wednesday morning of a city moving through itself. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. The thing you said in the board meeting about the promise you made to your daughter after you left the service. Was there a specific moment when you decided, or was it more gradual? He thought about it. He thought about it honestly, which meant sitting with the actual memory rather than the version of it he usually offered when people asked questions about his past, which was brief and deflective. Olivia had earned a real answer. He wasn't sure when that had become true, but it was. There was a mission, he said, in a country I can't name. 3 of my team were pinned down. There was an order, the correct order, tactically speaking, which was to pull back and wait for air support and let the situation develop. And I looked at the 3 men pinned down and I thought about what waiting meant, and I made a different call. He paused. We got them out. Everyone came home. But the action I took to make that happen was the kind that ends careers. Not because it was wrong, but because it was unauthorized. And when I came home and they were sorting out what happened, I sat in a room and someone asked me whether I'd do it differently if I could go back. What did you say? I said no, and they said, well, that's the problem. Because the job requires the ability to follow orders even when your instincts are telling you something different. And I thought about it, and I realized they were right, and that the job wasn't the right job for me anymore. Not because I'd lost the skills, because I'd found the limit. Olivia was very still. And Maisie was too, he said. Emma was still. My wife was still alive. And I came home, and I looked at both of them, and I thought about what I wanted to be present for, what I was willing to miss, and what I wasn't. And I made the choice. And then Emma died, she said quietly. 3 years later. He looked at the coffee mug. So the choice turned out to matter more than I knew when I made it. I got 3 years with her that I would have been gone for. And then she was gone. And I had Maisie. And the choice I'd made was the only reason I was equipped to be the parent she needed. The cafe moved around them. The barista making something that required the milk frother, a door opening and closing with a gust of November, 2 women laughing at a table near the back at something one of them had said that was apparently very good. I'm sorry about your wife, Olivia said. Thank you. Maisie, she's doing okay? She's 7. She carries things the way 7-year-olds carry things, which is differently than we do. Not easier, just differently. Is she like you? He thought about that. The question deserved real consideration. She's more curious than I am, more willing to put her hand up in a room full of strangers. I had to train myself out of the habit of making myself invisible. She never had it in the first place. He almost smiled. She's better than me at most things. She just doesn't know it yet. Olivia looked at him for a moment with the expression he'd noticed in the boardroom. Not pity, not admiration, but something that lived between them. Recognition, he'd decided it was. The specific feeling of seeing something you've been looking for without knowing you were looking. I want to say something, she said, and I want you to know I mean it professionally and not as a setup for anything else. Go ahead. You're the most competent person I've ever brought into a crisis. And I've brought in a lot of people. Consultants, former intelligence professionals, cybersecurity firms that charge $300 an hour for people who send PowerPoint decks. You walked in with no preparation, no backstory, no organizational chart, and you dismantled a sophisticated insider attack in 2 hours, while also identifying a secondary threat we hadn't even begun to think about. And then you went to pick up your kid. She paused. I don't know what to do with that professionally. It doesn't fit any model I have. It doesn't need to fit a model, he said. It's just what happened. But it points to something, about the gap between what people signal and what they're actually capable of. Victor wore the right suits and said the right things in the right meetings for 8 years. And you showed up in work boots and fixed a wiring problem and no one looked twice. She shook her head. My company almost paid for that assumption. Most companies do eventually. People who perform competence and people who have it look the same from a distance. You only find out the difference when something breaks. How do you tell them apart before something breaks? You watch how they handle being wrong. Competent people get quiet when they're wrong and loud when they're right. Performed competence is the opposite. She thought about that, turning it over the way she turned things over. Seriously, without rushing to an opinion. Victor got loud when the evidence was on the table, she said, and Devin got quiet when he realized what the logs meant. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, he did. Outside, someone had parked a delivery truck in a way that was causing a mild controversy involving 2 drivers and a parking enforcement officer who looked tired of both of them. They watched it briefly without commenting, the small accidental comedy of a city morning. The consulting contract, he said. I'll be available if you need me, but I want you to use Devin first. Build his team properly. Don't come to me for things he can handle because he can handle most things. Bring me in when it's something outside the normal range. Defined as? Well, no. If you're asking yourself whether it's outside the normal range, it probably is. She smiled at that. A real one, wider than the careful ones she'd offered before, the kind that changes the whole face. I'm going to take that as your version of a generous offer, she said. It's a practical offer. From you, those might be the same thing. He looked at his coffee, which he'd been working through slowly, the way he drank most things, without urgency. The cafe was warming up as the morning crowd thickened. The barista with the moth tattoo was explaining something to a new trainee, patient and specific, pointing at the machine with the instructional care of someone passing knowledge forward. He thought about all the rooms he'd sat in over the years, briefing rooms and command centers, and the backs of vehicles moving through dark country toward things he couldn't think about directly without the knowledge reshaping itself into something his nervous system wanted to respond to. He thought about the particular quality of attention required to operate in those rooms. Total, consuming, the self fully subordinated to the mission, which was exhilarating and corrosive in equal measure, and which he had chosen freely and given completely, and ultimately walked away from. Not because he was broken, but because he understood, finally, that what he was walking toward mattered more. He thought about Emma at the kitchen table, bent over her work. He thought about Maisie at the museum with her hair standing up and her arms spread. He thought about the printmaking tree and the collage and the things that are hard to see but still there. He thought about the man in the expensive suit who'd grabbed him by the collar in this room 3 weeks ago, about the silence that had followed, about the way rooms recalibrate around a person whose center of gravity is not where the room expected it to be. He'd spent 3 years building a life that was quiet and small and deliberate, and 3 weeks ago it had brushed up against the other life, the one he'd left, and he'd stepped into the contact zone and done what needed doing and stepped back out. And the quiet, small, deliberate life was still there when he returned to it. He'd been afraid, in some half-formed way he'd never articulated even to himself, that going back into that space, even briefly, even on his own terms, would make it harder to return to the ordinary one, that the pull would be stronger than he remembered, that the ordinary would feel diminished by comparison. It didn't. If anything, it was clearer. The cup of coffee and the school pickup and the groceries and Roy's back and Maisie's collage and the wiring in the walls of old buildings, all of it was clearer, more specific, more unmistakably itself, as if the contrast had sharpened his sense of what he was choosing and why. The strongest version of a choice is the one you make twice. Once when you make it the first time, not knowing what it costs, and once when you've seen the cost and you make it again anyway. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Olivia looked at him. "Of course." "That first morning, before Victor, before any of it, you were at that table with your spreadsheet and your team. What were you working on?" She looked surprised by the question. "Arcturus, actually. The cost structure in the final certification phase. We were about 4% over budget on the compliance side, and I was trying to figure out where to absorb it." "Did you figure it out?" "Eventually, not that morning." "Did the 4% work out?" "We ended up 3% over, which, given everything that subsequently happened to the budget, is frankly miraculous." He nodded. "You were clicking your pen," he said. "You didn't look up for a long time." She was still for a moment. "You noticed that?" "You were the most focused person in the room. Everyone else was watching Victor and watching each other. You were looking at the spreadsheet." "I was trying to ignore him, Victor. He did that. The performance, regularly. Usually not to strangers, but the dynamic was familiar. I'd learned to work through it." "Why did you keep him?" She looked at the table. "Because he was effective, for a long time. Because results excuse a lot in organizations that are growing fast and don't have time to stop and ask what the results are costing. And because..." She paused. "Because I promoted him early, when I was still figuring out what kind of leader I wanted to be, and admitting he was the wrong call would have meant admitting I'd gotten something significant wrong. And that's harder than it should be. It's harder for everyone than it should be. Is it hard for you?" He thought about the mission he'd described, about sitting in that room afterward, about the specific weight of knowing you made the right call and the right call still ended something. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She nodded slowly, accepting the answer, not trying to make it neater than it was. They finished their coffee. There was no particular signal that the conversation was ending, no checked watch or muttered obligation. It simply arrived at its natural boundary, the way conversations do when both people have said the thing they came to say, and the space after it is comfortable enough to sit in for a moment before standing. Caleb left the tip on the table, more than the coffee cost, which was his habit in places he returned to regularly. Olivia put on her coat and wrapped a scarf around her neck with the efficient motions of someone accustomed to Chicago Novembers, and they walked out of the cafe together and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold. "Thursday," she said, "Maisie's field trip." He looked at her. "You remembered that." "You mentioned it in the board meeting. No school nights. It implied a Thursday event." She said it simply, without making it more than it was. "Yeah, the Science Museum. Tell her the Van de Graaff generator and the electricity exhibit is worth touching." He looked at her for a moment. "She already touched it." "Good." She smiled again, the wider one. "She sounds like someone who figures out early what's worth doing." "She does." Olivia extended her hand. He shook it. Same grip as before, same directness. Her eyes were steady and unperformative and a little tired in the honest way of someone who has been carrying a lot for a long time and is learning how to set some of it down. "Thank you, Caleb," she said, "for all of it." "Send Devin my number," he said, "in case he needs a second opinion on something." "He already has it." "Of course he does." She walked in the direction of the Michigan Avenue building, collar up, moving with the particular forward-leaning momentum of a woman who has somewhere to be and the intention to be there. He watched her go, not because he meant to, but because he always watched the person leave, until she turned the corner and was gone. He stood on the sidewalk outside Elan for a moment. The morning was cold and ordinary and very bright in the specific way of late November, where the light has no warmth in it but carries a clarity that summer light doesn't, each thing lit exactly as it is rather than softened by heat. The L tracks overhead, the dry cleaner with the handwritten sign, the Thai restaurant that had been there since the 90s. The city moving around him in every direction, unhurried by any particular urgency. Just the accumulated motion of people going about the ordinary business of their lives. He had a job in Bridgeport at 11, a residential rewire, old house, the kind that takes patience and a willingness to work in tight spaces without cursing. Roy was meeting him there. He had groceries to pick up before 3:15 because he'd forgotten to go yesterday, and they were out of milk, and Maisie had pointed this out at breakfast with the measured disappointment of someone who takes dairy seriously. He needed to schedule the Evanston estimate for next week, and he owed the Wicker Park restaurant owner a revised proposal that he'd been working on in the evenings between Maisie's bedtime and his own. He would pick up his daughter at 3:17, 2 minutes late, same as always. He would ask her how her day was, and she would answer with thoroughness. He would make dinner, probably pasta, possibly soup if he remembered to pick up broth, and they would eat at the kitchen table and argue gently about whether a word like enormous was necessary in a world that already had the word big. He would lose at Go Fish. He would stand in the hallway after lights out and listen to her say goodnight to Gerald. These were not small things. He had spent a long time in a life before this one believing that the small things were what you sacrificed for the large ones. The missions, the operations, the classified urgencies of a world that needed people willing to live without an ordinary life. He'd been willing. He'd been genuinely willing for 11 years, and he didn't regret it, and he didn't romanticize it either. But the ordinary life was not the consolation prize. That was the thing he understood now in a way he hadn't when he made the choice, and which he understood more clearly each time something tested it. The ordinary life was the point, the coffee and the school pickup, and the wiring in old buildings, and the kid on the passenger seat asking questions about why enormous was a word. This was not what was left over after the important things were done. This was the important thing. He wasn't going to be written about anywhere. No commendation, no ceremony, no story told in the right room to the right people that would adjust how history remembered what he'd done. He'd prevented a company from being destroyed, twice, without his name attached to either instance. He'd stopped a man from building a career out of betrayal. He'd chosen his daughter over every version of his life that didn't have her in it, and he made that choice so quietly that most people would look at him and see only the work boots and the toolbox and the truck that needed brake pads. That was fine. That was, in fact, exactly right. The strongest man in the room, he had learned, was not the one who commanded it, was not the one who filled it with the evidence of his own significance, who measured the dimensions of every space he entered by how much of him it could contain. The strongest man in the room was the one who could sit still in it, who could be underestimated without being diminished, who knew the difference between what he could do and what he needed to do, and lived comfortably in the space between. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and walked back toward the truck, past the Thai restaurant and the dry cleaner with the sign under the L tracks where the shadows crossed the street in their grid pattern, through the ordinary bright November morning of a city that didn't know him and didn't need to. He had work to do, and at 3:17, someone would come running out of a school door without looking back, and he would be there, parked at the curb, and she would get in and buckle her seatbelt and show him something she'd made. And that would be enough. That would always be enough.